Hey everybody, it's Dak here from the Ed Boys, and today's topic of discussion is going to be the God Wars Dungeon. God Wars Dungeon is the most balanced PvM in the game in my opinion when it comes to difficulty, the money-making potential, and the overall speed when it comes down to actually grinding out any of these bosses. This doesn't mean that I hate all the other bosses in the game or that I think God Wars Dungeon is perfect. And to be fair, I didn't even put a God Wars Dungeon boss as my number 1 on my top 10 PvM moneymakers list. But that was really for individual bosses. I do love raids, and I could make a video very similar to this one with just raids involved, but God Wars Dungeon as a whole is on top of my list, and I want to discuss why. I'm going to start with the best part of really any bossing, which is the loot. We could all be honest, there are very few bosses in the game that if they just had no loot, and the only point of fighting them was to have fun, you wouldn't fight them. The God Wars Dungeon bosses feature some of the best gear in the game as loot. You've got the Bandos chestplate and tassets, Armadyl chainskirt and chestplate, Armadyl crossbow, Staff of the Dead, Zami spear, and don't forget about hilts and Godsword shards. A lot of these items are very expensive, even a little over 40 mil for an armored chestplate at the time of writing up this video. The rest of the drop table is generally pretty weak. It's usually just enough to pay for your supplies and whatnot, and then usually profiting maybe a couple 100k an hour, but it's all about getting those big ticket items. One unique can make up for 10 plus hours of getting nothing very quickly, and 10 hours between uniques is generally pretty dry depending on how fast you're getting kills, I guess. I'm personally a fan of this balance. The regular drops feel like they blow for such a high level monster, but like I said, they're normally enough to still profit slightly and pay off everything, so you're not going to be losing money. And it's important for bosses to not make a lot of money by just dumping supplies into the game. That destroys the prices of these items, which is not only bad for that boss, but for other bosses that drop those items. Even some skilling moneymakers can be affected negatively from too many supplies being flooded into the game. So I do think it's important that the amount of profit you make should be focused on the uniques, not on the regular drops. I'm still a fan of bosses like Zulrah and Vorkath, which focus very heavily on expensive, consistent drops. They have their place in the game, but more often than not, I think bossing loot tables should be more focused on them uniques. The price of uniques can heavily depend on how good an item is, of course, and there's a lot of best-in-slot items that you can get from God Wars Dungeon. These uniques are balanced pretty well at this point, mostly because they've been best in slot since they were added a while back, so new content's generally been balanced around it, but I do think a lot of the God Wars Dungeon items are clearly some of the better balanced things that have been added to the game. Getting a lot of kills per hour on a God Wars Dungeon boss can take some effort and is generally capped at no more than 25 an hour. Once you get the fight down, it's not really difficult to grind out uniques, but it can be a little slow. It might sound crazy, but I do believe that having a remotely low pace of kill is a good thing for uniques. Plus, there's only one boss per world, unlike Zulrah and Vorkath and a bunch of Slayer bosses, so we're limiting the amount of God Wars Dungeon uniques that are being added to the game, which helps the price stay high. The actual killing of the boss is not always very slow, especially if you have a team, but there are a couple of things that can slow down the fight a little bit. First of all, each boss has 3 minions in the room that will be attacking you at the same time, one for each attack style. These minions can be very intimidating when you're just starting out with God Wars Dungeon, but they attack pretty slow and they have max hits all generally under 20. I think the max I've seen is a 21. They're also very good for practicing being attacked by multiple opponents and flicking prayers between monsters. You don't have to be able to flick to fight a God Wars Dungeon boss, but it can save you a lot of food and make for a lot longer trips. I am a fan of bosses that you can kill with very simple efforts, just eating when you get to low health, but also have some mechanics involved where if you choose, you can get better kills by actually having to be good at PvM mechanics. The minions also give you extra kills on each round, which helps out with profit, and they can drop uniques at a very rare rate, which makes for a more interesting loot table. Just getting something that's insanely rare, especially if it is still very expensive, is one of the cooler PvM feelings in the game. You not only have to kill the boss and all 3 minions, but there is a 1.5-minute respawn timer for each of the bosses. This limits your kills per hour, no doubt, but it's also fairly needed since you're supposed to be killing the minions between each fight. With a shorter timer, soloing some of these bosses could be a real pain in the ass, and in general, it's nice to have a few seconds to get yourself prepared for another kill. Even if you have a team and you're going through it quickly, you might have to trade some of those teammates to supply up for each person, so sometimes it is nice to have a little time between. The kills can be a little slow, though realistically 2 or 3 minutes per kill is pretty normal for a boss, but the bank trips are also slowed down because you need to get 40 kills to get back into the lair. The trip from the bank to God Wars Dungeon is not very far if you have good teleports, but getting 40 kills can be a little lengthy, especially if we're talking about Armadyl minions. You can collect ecumenical keys in the Wilderness God Wars Dungeon, which lets you skip these kills, but it still requires some time to grind out the keys. It's often not used to make the kills any faster, but it helps with not using supplies on the minions when you're taking the actual boss trip. 20 to 25 kills an hour is really not that much slower than fighting Zora or Vorkath or even the Hydra, but those fights are just long from full health to a dead monster. They don't have any mechanics in between that make it a little bit longer. God Wars Dungeon has a few other factors involved in there with pace of kill, which maybe doesn't necessarily change a lot, but it is a different balance than most of the other bosses, where you just kill the one boss over and over and over again with only like 5 seconds between fights. One issue with only having one boss per world is that the boss can be very crowded. Having to hop and find a free world can be pretty difficult, but this should motivate you to get good at the boss so that your trips are even longer, so you don't have to find a new world as often. There is also an issue with crashers sometimes, but realistically, that's part of any MMO. There's other people there that can compete for loot, and again, this should probably motivate you to be getting higher levels in gear so that you can beat other players for the kills. When it comes to bossing, I always suggest higher tier gear and levels when you actually want to grind it out, just so that the fight is reasonably fast and you're making good money instead of scrounging for kills. But this is another excuse that if you want to do God Wars Dungeon bossing, you might not want to go for it at minimum levels. Crashing does blow, but you're going to get crashed eventually if you're going for hundreds of kills, and there's a good chance that guy's going to have higher levels than you if you have bare minimums. I did say before that I like the one boss per world because it's good for uniques, and I do stand behind that. A lot of Slayer bosses have instances too, but they also require a specific Slayer task, which means you can't just grind them out like crazy. You couldn't do 24 hours a day of the one Slayer boss unless you happen to have a lot of Slayer points stacked up, which already took time. Once you get to the point you can fight a God Wars Dungeon boss, you could fight that all day, every day. There's really nothing stopping you. So if we had an instance for this boss, that would mean thousands of players are fighting them at all times, and the uniques would be pretty cheap at this point. A boss like Zora has a bunch of pretty cheap uniques, even though the blowpipe is one of the best weapons in the game. You can turn the uniques into Zora's scales, which kind of makes the prices of scales and uniques correlated, which does make a big difference. But even before that update, the uniques were not insanely expensive. In fact, that update saved them in the long run. They were just going to keep getting cheaper and cheaper because we weren't taking any of them out of the game. With the current death mechanics, you can get your stuff back very easily from basically anything you fight, except maybe a PKer. So not a lot of items are leaving the game. This means that it's very important to not flood the game with uniques, or they're going to become cheap, and good money makers are really going to no longer exist. They'll keep having to add new, better items and new, better bosses, which will make the old items obsolete, and we're slowly talking about RS3 here. Let's go over the actual bosses a bit, starting with Saradomin. Commander Zilyana is the Saradomin general, and generally considered the easiest boss to kill in God Wars Dungeon. Range is the most common style to use against Zilly, since you can just run around the room to get away from her. You only take damage from one minion at a time if you're doing this correctly, and you can even flick your prayers to take 0 damage. The uniques are pretty rare. Armadyl Crossbow and Saradomin Hilt are both a 1 in 508 drop. All of the other bosses in this dungeon have a super expensive drop that's a little more common than these ones, but these uniques still add up very well, being around 60 mil combined. In fact, when the Saradomin Hilt was around 50 mil on its own, this was arguably the best moneymaker in here. You can also get Saradomin swords at a 1 in 127 rate, but those are under a mil, so it's not as exciting, but it still pays for a lot of your supplies. It's still worth a couple hours worth of regular drops. Saradomin is a good starting point for God Wars Dungeon fighting. Like I said, it's the easiest to kill, usually being the least intense fight since you don't deal with as many minions. You can kill Saradomin creatures for your 40 KC right outside the room. It's a mediocre pace for 40 kills, but you can make sure you use 0 supplies by fighting monsters that are already in combat. You don't need great gear to kill Zilyana. Even a rune crossbow warrior can find some KC in here, though the best weapon to use is a T-bow, so rich people can get really good kills too. Saradomin Pet is pretty cool, but probably the least eye-catching of the 4 for me. This isn't a diss on the pet, I just think the other 3 are that much cooler, not that I don't like this one. General Greyordor is the general for the Bandos section of the dungeon. Bandos is one of the most OG bosses in RuneScape, and in my opinion gives the most nostalgic bossing feel of any of them. You tend to kill Bandos with melee, but there are some magic methods you can use too, especially if you're fighting with a group of people. The general strategy doesn't involve running around the room, so you will be tanking the boss's range hits and the range and magic minions. This can be a little hectic taking so many hits at once, but it still just comes down to eating when your health gets low. The general strategy is to attack Greyordor twice, then run under him. He does attack a little bit slower than you, so by doing this, you delay his second attack until you run back out from under him and attack him again. Basically, this makes him attack at half of your speed instead of just slightly slower than your speed. The Bandos chestplate and Bandos tassets are both a 1 in 381 drop on their own, but they share a drop table with Bandos boots. This means you have a 1 in 127 chance to land on that drop table, and then a 1 in 3 chance of whichever item on the table. Overall, though, if you have a good relationship with RNGesus, it's really not unreasonable to expect a chestplate and tassets every 400 or so kills. Combined, they're worth about 50 mil, which is generally going to be more money than we were talking about with Zilyana's uniques. Even though those added up to be more, they're a little more rare. Clearly getting everything on the drop rate can be fairly luck dependent, and if we're just talking hour by hour, you're likely not to get a unique every hour, so not each hour you're going to make 2 to 3 mil, but sometimes you can make 20 to 30 mil real quick. It's also very easy to kill some goblins kind of outside the Bandos lair, which means getting an ecumenical key is pretty unnecessary for Bandos. I also like the Bandos pet a lot. This is one of my favorite pets in the game, mostly because of how annoying he is. Ironically, if you've never stood by a Bandos pet in-game with your game sounds on, you got to do it. Next time you see a Bandos pet, turn on your in-game sounds. You will hear the Bandos pet immediately. That boy stomps. Krill Tsutsaroth, which I always have a hard time saying its name. I can't be alone on that one. He's the Zami general and my personal least favorite boss in this dungeon. The boss fight is very similar to Bandos, though Krill is a demon, so the arc light is a pretty common weapon in here and tends to cost you a little less than using either an abyssal tentacle or a scythe. Krill has a special attack which can max hit at 49, and you're tanking 2 minions, which means the KO potential in here is a lot higher than it is at Bandos and Saradomin. Plus, killing the minions in Krill doesn't drop any bones, so bones to peaches can't help with making your trips any longer in here. Krill's loot table is also not as appetizing IMO. The Zami spear price was saved with the addition of Hydra's Claw. If you attach a Hydra's Claw to the spear, you get a Dragon Hunter Lance, which is a very top tier item. Zami spears are 16 mil and a 1 in 127 drop. You also have a Staff of the Dead at 1 in 127, which is a 5 mil drop. Zami has the least expensive hilt at under 5 mil, but it's still a nice bonus to get one as a drop. Overall, none of his loot hits over 20 mil on a single drop, but you still make solid cash here, and he has one of the cooler looking pets in the game. I am personally a big fan of fighting Zami in teams, since it tends to make your trips a lot longer, and I usually have pretty short ones when I solo. I'm not a huge fan of this boss, but it still does give good options for both solo and team fights, and the money in here isn't bad. The uniques are generally a little more common than the others, even though they're cheaper. They're just not, they're not as great. If it weren't for the Dragon Hunter Lance, the Zami Spear would be dead. It was under 10 mil. Now it's 16. That's a lot better than it was. Finally, I've got Kriera, who is the general of the Armadyl area. Arma is no doubt my favorite boss to fight in the dungeon, and is considered the hardest boss in here, but it has less knockout potential than Zami when it's done right. It's just a lot more click intensive if you're using chins. When it comes to fighting Arma, using Chinchampas is going to get you the fastest kills and in the long run the most money, but because Chinchampas are so expensive to use, you generally need a lot of money to get started. The regular drops from Arma are not going to be enough to pay for your chins, so you do need uniques to start profiting, but the uniques from Arma are very expensive and the kills per hour are pretty quick. The Arma chestplate, chain skirt, and helm all share a drop table just like the Bandos drops, a 1 in 127 to hit the table, and then 1 in 3 for each item. These items are a lot more expensive than the Bandos drops though. The chestplate is 40, almost 41 mil at the moment, and the chain skirt is about 33 mil, and even the helm is 5 mil at the moment, which is like 25 times more expensive than the Bandos boots. Armadyl drops are some of the most exciting to get in the game, and overall they can make you pretty rich in the long run. I am a little biased on Arma because I do love the look of the pet, and even though it is my favorite boss in the dungeon, I do have Sarah and Bandos pretty close on the list. All of these God Wars dungeon pets are a 1 in 5k drop, making them very rare to get, but anybody with the willpower to grind out 5,000 kills from any of these bosses is going to make a ton of money by the time they're done. One of the most balanced parts of God Wars Dungeon is that you can solo or show up in teams and still make a very similar amount of money. Many bosses don't have very reasonable options for both solos and teams. For the most part, if you can solo a boss, then it's kind of a waste of time to do it in teams. Why not just solo? And if it's good in teams, then you likely can't solo it very well. God Wars Dungeon gives a variety of players a chance to fight a boss, from max combat Ironmen maybe, who are looking for new solid gear, to even bare minimum stat warriors that happen to have 2 friends hoping to get a good split. The boss that I have the most team kills in would be Arma, and it's also my second most solo kills, so it's my best point of reference for this profit. The best part of having a teammate on Arma is tied between not having to click the boss between each chin, assuming your teammate isn't chinning also. Plus, I don't have to throw nearly as many Chinchampas per kill, saving me a lot of money. For any of the 4 bosses, you're going to be taking less damage per kill since there's multiple people in the room for them to target. You're also bringing twice as many supplies with 2 inventories, and the kills are happening twice as fast, including downing the 3 minions after the boss kill. This means that you're being attacked by less monsters, for less time on each kill, and you have a teammate who also brought in food. In the long run, your trips are going to be far longer with a team than if you solo it, which is pretty nice for a couple of friends trying to camp it out for the night. In terms of profit, I found that I was normally making slightly more from soloing since I didn't have to split the drops, but because of my teammates soaking up some of the supplies that I needed to use and the kills were faster with multiple people, meaning more uniques, the profits were still similar, which means that it's not a waste of time for anybody who likes to solo to bring a friend occasionally and make it a little bit more relaxed. For my exiting notes, I think God Wars Dungeon is an exciting and nostalgic PvM option in the game, and maybe the nostalgia makes me a little bit biased here, but you can make a lot of money from God Wars Dungeon, and it's very well balanced overall and has some of my favorite pets in the game. I believe that's everything I wanted to say when talking about the God Wars Dungeon, everybody. Continue the discussion below. So far, it clearly has been very one-sided. This is just me rambling on to you about how much I love God Wars Dungeon. If you love or hate God Wars, let me know in the comments section below. Again, continue that discussion. If you've been enjoying the content lately, be sure to like and subscribe for even more content. I'm also on Twitch. I do have a Twitter, and I have a Discord, which all links are in the description. I appreciate you watching, everybody. I do hope you enjoyed, and best of luck on your grind.